Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we have another innovator interview today with Tony Juniper, the author of Rainforest, Dispatches from Earth's Most Vital Frontiers. Tony, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Well, very good. Very nice to have a conversation with you, Mitch, and much to talk about on the subject of rainforests, that's for sure.
Well, there definitely is. And before we start, I just want to give the folks a little background on you. You are a longtime activist on behalf of the environment and currently the chairman of Natural England, which is the British government's environmental organization. This is a really huge topic. You have spent your entire life traveling the world, and you do a great job of explaining all of the important roles that the rainforest plays in our lives, even though we are half a world away. What is a rainforest in the most basic sense in your telling?
Well, it's basically an ecosystem that's defined by trees and water, as the name might suggest. So above a certain threshold of annual rainfall, and spread pretty evenly across the year, although some rainforests are more seasonal than others, you have the definition of a rainforest. So an ecosystem with trees that receives a lot of moisture from the atmosphere, and then beyond that, there are various subcategories of cloud forest, lowland rainforest, some kinds of forests that are in the temperate zones as well as in the tropical zones. So a pretty broad sweep of different kinds of habitats, but surprisingly restricted across the face of the earth. And so the tropical rainforests cover, or did cover once, around 7% of the land area. And the temperate rainforests much, much less than that, with just little strips, often in coastal areas, including in the United States and Canada on the western side.
Now, you describe the rainforest as the lungs of the earth. How does that analogy to our own bodies help people understand what the rainforest does for the planet?
Yeah, so people will know the lungs as the way in which we exchange gases with the atmosphere between our bodies and the air, and the rainforests are comparable insofar as they are removing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. With our lungs, of course, it's the reverse. We're taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. But nonetheless, these ecosystems, in discharging that basic role of all vegetation does this, but the rainforests are particularly important because they're such dense stores of carbon and such rich sources of photosynthesis that they have a disproportionate effect on the carbon and oxygen cycles in the atmosphere. And so that's where the idea of the lungs of the earth comes from. Equally, they might be described as an air conditioning system, not least because of the moisture they're putting into the air, which is helping to cool things down via evaporation. And they are in many ways not only important in the regions where they exist, but also globally. And in terms of that lungs of the earth analogy, one of the most important global functions of the tropical rainforests is to be catching and storing carbon, which otherwise would be in the atmosphere. And the more we destroy these ecosystems, the more carbon is going into the air. And at the same time, the more we're interrupting that fundamentally important service of oxygen recycling, which is obviously disappearing at the same time as the trees are being removed.
Now, can we extend the analogy just a bit? How would you describe what we have done to the lungs of the earth? Have we given it emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease? Are there? How would you describe what we have done to our planet's body?
Well, hopefully we've not yet inflicted terminal cancer. Hopefully what we've got is quite serious bronchitis that hopefully can still be reversed through some love and care and attention. And I think we have to be optimistic about these subjects. And in the case of the forest, one of the things that I do try to emphasize throughout the book is the extent to which there are successful projects and programs in different parts of the world that are making a positive difference. But we have removed about half of what we had at the time of the voyage of Columbus, and the other half that remains, much of it's in central Brazil and in central South America, rather, much of it in Brazil and the Amazon, much of it, of course, in Central Africa. And in both cases, we're still eating away at what remains, and at quite a terrifying rate in some instances. And those fires in Brazil this year are a stark and vivid reminder of just how devastating the impact of conversion on these ecosystems can be, with those pictures being broadcast around the world of those massive forest fires spewing smoke into the atmosphere, in the process not only destroying the vegetation but also the rich web of life which is dependent upon those forest ecosystems. So this is an advanced state of bronchitis which continues to get worse, but it needn't do. And we do have choices, and those choices increasingly are becoming clear to people. But of course, even when we have popular demand for more respect and for more sustainable use of these places, we still have vested interests who can see profitability in the replacement of those forests with something else. And in the case of those Amazonian fires, it's really the soybean and beef industries that are seeing the opportunities for financial gain through replacing these ecosystems with what are in the marketplace financially lucrative activities. Of course, what is less visible in the short term is the extent to which the forest intact actually is worth much more than it is as a soybean field. But unfortunately, the way our economic system works at the moment, that particular reality is not translated into the incentives and the behavior of the people.
Now, after all the decades that you've spent on this, do you feel that humans are finally alert to the real threat of climate change? Are we there yet?
Well, it's remarkable, the change in the discussion in this part of the world, and I would hope to know that the same thing is going on in the United States. And in these days, of course, with open media and social media channels, I think probably this is a global phenomenon. The extent to which now people are waking up and realizing that this is no longer some theoretical future threat. It's on our doorstep. It's happening now, and that we are extremely short of time in being able to take the actions that are going to avoid the worst of this. And I do think that message and that understanding has spread far and wide in a very short time. And one would hope that we would see the action and the political commitment following in the wake of that shift in public opinion. And it was quite heartening today to hear the Secretary General of the United Nations speaking in Madrid at the most recent conference of the parties of the United Nations Climate Change Convention, telling us that now the time for action has actually arrived and that we cannot obfuscate and delay any longer. We really do need now to be stepping up the action in a dramatic way. And I think everybody who listens to those news broadcasts now pretty much understands the issues, and the vast majority of people would agree with him that we now need to really dramatically up our game, because we know that we're already crossing critical thresholds, and that if we don't act very soon, that we might well find we've left it too late. And indeed, some people say we're on the very cusp of the point of it being too late in terms of certain key tipping points. For example, the complete disintegration of the Greenland ice sheet and the collapse of some of the Antarctic ice sheets.
Now, your book, in addition to being a tour of all the different types of rainforests around the world, which is wonderfully enlightening to read, is an account of your effort to raise awareness throughout the 90s and early 2000s up to now. Now, I particularly remember a campaign you worked with, Mahogany is Murder. And it actually made me wake up to the fact that when I was in shop class in the 70s, they made me completely aware of the value of mahogany without telling me any of the consequences. And I think the thing that I took away from your book is there's many roadmaps for action to raise what are essentially local issues that are globally connected. And if you could talk a little about how that campaign came about, it would be great to hear the story.
Yeah. Very good, Mitchell. I'm delighted to know that you noticed this work back in the early to mid-90s. And this was really a piece of work that was born out of some of my very early experiences as a campaigner for the tropical rainforests, speaking to the British media and trying to get them to cover the story in a way that would galvanize action. And they basically said to me, these things happening on the other side of the world really are not of that great an interest to our readers and to our viewers, because it just seems so far away and so remote, and people just don't think they can do anything about it. And with that thought in mind, I had a trip to Brazil in the early 1990s, in 1991, where I met a group of colleagues. They turned into, in the end, a group called the Amazon Working Group, and they were a collection of rubber tappers, indigenous groups, people living from extracting fruits and other products from the forest, and they were campaigning for sustainable use of the Amazon. And I spoke to them and they said, look, one of the biggest problems we've got at the moment is the illegal extraction of mahogany. And I said, well, that sounds like an interesting issue. Tell me more about it. And they did. And they told me about the loggers going into indigenous reserves and into national parks to get this very valuable tree. A single tree could be worth thousands of dollars. So big incentives to make illegal activities happen. And this brought the logging companies into direct conflict with the Indians. There were fights going on, people were being killed, and almost worse than that, diseases including measles and flu were being brought into very remote communities and repeating the wave of destruction that followed the first European colonization in the 15th century. And so this was, actually, it was in 1992, it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus arriving in the Caribbean. And so the moment for this was particularly good from that point of view. But the thing was, I said to them, well, where's this mahogany going? And they said, well, most of it's going to the United Kingdom and the United States. And I thought, well, this maybe finally is the way in which we're going to be able to connect the consumers in Britain with something they can actually do to affect an outcome on the other side of the world. So we launched the Mahogany is Murder campaign, highlighting the impact on the indigenous people, and effectively advised everybody not to buy it. Mahogany is murder, don't buy it. That was the campaign slogan. And it really worked. It took off, and we had not only the public, but also many stores and DIY chains, do-it-yourself shops where people bought wood for furniture making and these kinds of things. And it really had an impact, and it had such an impact, and it took off in the United States as well as the UK, but the impact very quickly traveled to Brazil, where the market effect of this basically was devastating. And the Brazilian government found that, they were being embarrassed on the global stage because of this set of connections. And so they took a lot of action and put resources in. They funded the Environment Department to take more actions against illegal logging, and it did actually create something of a crackdown, which was positive. And so that was a good example for me of how it's possible to make a difference when you can find some way of bringing consumers, the economics of a situation, and governments and activism together to be able to create some forces for good. And in that case, it did have a positive effect. But of course, as we were discussing a moment ago, the continued deforestation in the Amazon, it remains, although in the modern context with different sources of deforestation compared to back in the 90s when there was a lot of logging going on. There was indeed clearance for cattle pasture, but not on the scale that we've seen since, and this remains a major problem. And actually, I do wonder whether we've got some lessons to learn from the past now, in the extent to which the Brazilian government might be willing to reconsider its policy if there were some coordinated campaign focused on the export of soybeans and beef from the Amazon as the way in which we create some level of pressure from outside.
And that was actually my next question. Is it sounds like there are a lot of emerging, or at least increasing awareness around products or services coming out of rainforest resources that we're not aware of the consequences of using. And so soya and beef are two obvious examples. Yeah. On the other hand, there's the flip side. Can we start to bring more sustainable products out of those environments so that there's a different economic incentive involved?
The answer is yes, we can do this in a different way. Some colleagues at WWF, where I was working until quite recently, we'd done a study of the loss of the savanna forests just to the south and east of the Amazon in Brazil in particular, the so-called Cerrado forests. And these too are being cleared for soya beans in particular, and with devastating effects for the wildlife, for the rivers, for carbon into the atmosphere, and for the local people. And we began looking quite closely at some of the issues linked with that particular part of the world, and the same applies to the Amazon. We discovered that the area of land already cleared and degraded is capable of producing much more food if only the land could be restored rather than clearing new land, which equally will become quickly degraded because of the agricultural methods being used there. So there's definitely an issue around the extent to which we might take remedial action on land that was cleared years ago. It was used for farming for a short time. The soils were either damaged or destroyed, and then people have moved on and cleared more forest. If we go back to those areas that were cleared a long time ago, we could be producing food there, but actually there is so much cleared and degraded land that we could be reforesting it as well. So we could be having more food and more forest without cutting anything else, which is, basic, simple arithmetic around the land that's been already opened up. Now, this then is about the incentives and the economics of the situation and the extent to which people can be encouraged to invest in land that can be brought back into productive use rather than taking the cheaper route of opening up land which is already covered with forest or which remains forested. And sometimes, and in the case of the palm oil industry in Indonesia, where a similar situation prevails, there's plenty of land. It's not for land that people are short of. It's just the incentives are going into the good areas of forest are actually stronger, because in the palm oil industry, very often they go in and cut the logs, and the sale of the logs then helps to pay for the plantations of the palm oil to be established.
Right.
And so the economics of the deforestation and the plantation establishment are closely linked together. So can we break that? Well, yes, of course we can. It's going to require some thinking and some policy making, both by governments and companies. These things, they're not impossible to fix, not by any means. It's really a question of galvanizing the political will and making sure that we actually do what we say we're going to do. And this is when then some of the big food and commodity buying chains, so Walmart and Unilever and some of these big global presences, if they started to insist that there was to be no deforestation in any of the products they were going to buy from any of these big commodity traders, then that certainly would make a difference. And some of them are already moving in this direction, but they've got to be much firmer. They've got to be much clearer with the people they're purchasing from, that it is no longer acceptable to cut any remaining forest in order to supply markets. And I think, from what I've learned over the years, that would be a powerful way of focusing people's minds, people who otherwise, all they can see is the short-term economic benefits for themselves rather than the long-term ecological, social, and indeed economic costs for the whole world. And so there does need to be a little bit of a change of message from the West, I think, to those countries. And of course, it's not all about threats of, withdrawal of market access. This can be a very positive agenda where companies are investing in countries to help this journey go in a better way more quickly.
So, and one of the things about reforestation and the approach to food that you're talking about is that you get a better range of nutrients out of the forest than you do out of these single crop monocultural industrial approaches. Now, and it was encouraging to see you finish the book by saying, we can not only grow back stop this, but we can grow back what we have destroyed. And the question I kind of, run into every time I read that statement or that sentiment is, are we really doing enough on the political side? You've mentioned the political will necessary to change this. Are the global accords like the Paris Agreement actually making the necessary difference?
Not yet, they're not, but they need to, because it's wonderful that some countries are taking these issues increasingly seriously, but it's going to require a collective effort across the board to be able to sort these issues of climate breakdown and mass extinction of biodiversity, to be able to find resolution to them. It's going to require all countries, especially the really big ones like the United States, like Brazil, like Indonesia, to be around the table. And sometimes these countries, they give rather a mixed commentary, to put it mildly. And so President Bolsonaro of Brazil, he's been pretty clear that, he sees the Amazon as something that needs to be opened up and liquidated for national development. President Trump has said that he's not going to support the Paris Accord. These kinds of political statements are deeply, deeply unhelpful, and actually, I'd say, are extremely dangerous as we approach these tipping points in the climate system, never mind the damage that's being inflicted on natural ecosystems. And so we do need to up the political commitment, and I think in democracies the only way that's going to happen is if it's coming from the voters and the people. And, President Bolsonaro and President Trump, they have their reasons for saying these things, and in neither case it has anything to do with science. It's about politics and the extent to which they have correctly judged that there was a constituency of people who would vote for those kinds of sentiments, and they did, both in Brazil and the United States. And so this requires activists, I think, to carefully wonder what kind of campaigning would make a difference in the future. And I have to say, actually, that the environmentalists may wish to reflect on some of the messages that have been put out in recent years, which would lead some voters to think that actually they'd much rather support the President Trump view of life rather than the environmentalist view of life. And if, for example, you are a West Virginia coal miner, if you work in the auto sector in Detroit, if you were a steel worker in Pennsylvania, you might hear the climate change story as being something which was against your community, against your job, against the pride of the kind of work that you do. And therefore, you might be quite willing to believe and to vote for something which sounded like it was the opposite, and that climate change wasn't true and that nothing needed to be done. And to that extent, maybe we environmentalists need to think a little bit more carefully about how we bring those kinds of viewpoints, which are perfectly valid, with us on the journey, rather than alienating people. And there has been this discussion about so-called just transition in recent years, about how we make the step from high carbon to low carbon, but by protecting jobs and protecting livelihoods and bringing people in a positive way on the journey. So I do think that the question around Paris and the extent to which it's not being followed in all countries naturally leads into these kinds of conversations about how we shift the political discourse in countries, and then that in turn is about understanding what's gone wrong. Because in some places, as I say, there is a strong body of support against doing anything, which is completely mad from a scientific point of view, but at the point of view of the voters ticking their boxes, it seems perfectly rational to them. And so we need to understand that and to work with it in ways which is hopefully going to break out of that trap, which unfortunately is a very real one at the moment.
So the political position of an environmentalist today seems to me to be need to be informed by the idea of investment and return on that investment, the benefit to society, because the accords are all about what we should not do and the things that we should not, the tipping points we should avoid. What's the positive investment-based approach that we might take? Have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have many thoughts on that, Mitch, and I've written quite a few pieces. I did a couple of books, one called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, and another one called What Nature Does for Britain, trying to bring the thinking in the global analysis into kind of sharper focus here in the UK. And basically my thesis is that looking after nature is not something which is about stopping economic development or about closing things down. It's about realizing a whole range of huge benefits which actually are essential for the human economy as we try and navigate the challenges of the 21st century. And what I try to do is to point out how the restoration of forests, how the recovery of soils, how the protection and restoration of coral reefs and mangroves, how all of these and a multitude of other things actually bring bigger economic benefits than trashing them does, if you see what I mean. And so, we've fallen into this kind of mythology in many countries based on this idea of endless economic growth and, the idea that we can only achieve progress if we liquidate nature. And, this idea that, the destruction of the natural world is the regrettable but the inevitable consequence of how we achieve progress. That's been the kind of mood music in finance ministries, in boardrooms for decades. We're now moving to the point where we realize that actually for all of our human needs, for our economy, for our society, for our very civilization, all of it rests upon healthy natural systems and functioning ecosystems. And if we wish to have security, stability, and human needs met into the future, then the best thing we can do is to protect and restore the natural environment. And so that then comes quite a positive set of messages around clean water, catching carbon, health and well-being, food security, and indeed new kinds of industries based upon innovations that are coming from the natural world, so-called harnessing of biomimicry, and there's other ways in which we can express these opportunities too. So there is a very, very positive story out there, but I think it does need to be predicated on this idea of just saying that, this notion of economic growth being something we have to pursue at the expense of the environment, this is just wrong. It's just simply not true. And I think once we break that piece of mythology, then I think we can start to make some progress. It is beginning to happen, actually. I'm quite optimistic about that. When I published What Has Nature Ever Done for Us a few years ago, I did say to myself, hopefully, this is going to make a small contribution to the point where politicians will not feel as though they can stand up and say we have to balance environmental destruction against economic growth. They will stop saying it because it's rubbish and it's mad. And if enough people know it's rubbish and it's mad, they'll stop saying it. And actually, I'm happy to say that in the UK, at least now, I think we have reached that point where politicians now do not stand up in the Houses of Parliament and say we have to get rid of environmental laws in order to grow the economy. They stopped saying that a couple of years ago as this understanding and consensus began to emerge. Mm-hmm. And so I think we are beginning to break through into a new understanding. And actually, some of the work of a group called Extinction Rebellion, which I'm sure you're finding, are they active in the US, Mitch, Extinction Rebellion?
Not as active as in the UK, certainly. But it's beginning to rise.
Yeah, they've made a big difference here in being able to talk about the need for a change in our fundamental understanding. And actually, I see young kids demonstrating here in Cambridge on some of the school strike days, and they have placards proclaiming it's system change, not climate change that we want, which tells me that they're actually beginning to get it in actually quite a profound way. And actually, when you see the 15-year-olds going out with banners arguing for system change, especially when they're going to very good schools here in Cambridge, you know that in 20, 30 years' time, these kids are going to be running corporations, they're going to be in politics, they're going to be running newspapers, they're going to be running new startup businesses. And you think, actually, there is a great deal of hope to be had from that very fact that at least this message around the need for a fundamental shift in our worldview around our relationship with the natural environment, it is being picked up by some of these youngsters who are now starting to run with that narrative in ways that are unavoidable. People do have to engage with it.
Well, your observation about Extinction Rebellion is interesting from the perspective of what you did back in the 90s, is like the sunken house. So they recently, for the listeners, had a sunken house float down the Thames. And of course, this created a photo opportunity, and it brought home exactly what we're talking about, houses being inundated by water, just as Mahogany's murder did back in the 90s. And what I also feel is happening in response to what you're saying is that the lessons of our generation are being passed on and amplified by a new generation, which are going to take and implement it, which involves a lot of science, a lot of business, and a lot of organizational skills that we are continuing to develop as a species. But we are still all in this together. It is not one generation that's going to save another. It's all the generations finally pulling together to save the world.
Exactly. And actually, one of the heartening things to see with the Extinction Rebellion protests that we had in London during October was the fact that there were grandmothers and people evidently more advanced in years campaigning with the youngsters, and that was good. The thing about the young people, however, is that I think they bring a unique moral voice to this, because those of us who are slightly older, we won't see the worst effects of what's going to happen as a result of pollution and environmental destruction happening now, but these youngsters will do. So I think they bring a particularly powerful voice to the conversation, and good for them.
Absolutely, and without them, we will not make the change. Well, Tony, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've been speaking with Tony Juniper, who is chairman of Natural England. And Tony, where can folks keep up with your work?
Well, I use Twitter, so I'm at Tony Juniper on Twitter, and I write various bits and pieces which go into various publications, and actually, generally, I will put them on Twitter. So I think maybe that's the best way to find out what I'm up to.
Great.
And I will be more active again on Twitter once we've had our general election. So I'm fairly quiet just while we're going through that process as a member of the public service here in the UK. I don't say much during elections, but I will be saying a lot afterwards. So
well, I wish you a rational outcome to your election.
Thank you very much. We certainly need it.
Folks, we've been talking with Tony Juniper, who's the author of Rainforest, Dispatches from Earth's Most Vital Front Lines, and that's published by Allen Press. You can find it on Amazon.com right now, and we'll have a link in the article for the podcast. Tony, thanks very much. Have a great afternoon.
My pleasure, Mitch. It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Folks, we'll be back with another Sustainability in Your Ear soon. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth 911. Have a great day.